You're listening to the StatsBomb Football Podcast.
One half a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us.
Welcome back to the StatsBomb Football Podcast. I am your host, as always, Seth Partnow, Director of North American Sports at StatsBomb. I am joined today, as always, by Matthew Edwards, head of football analysis, head of American football analysis, sometimes have to say. And we have a special guest this week. We have well-known football analytics in the football and general sports analytics space. Among other things, the host of the Wharton Moneyball podcast, where both myself and Ted have been frequent guests. Wharton professor of practice Cade Massey has joined us today. Thanks for hopping on.
Morning. Thank you. Happy to be here.
We'll obviously have you on with the draft starting tomorrow. You've had interesting things to say about the NFL draft and sort of sports decision making in general. But before we get to that, I would be remiss if we did not go straight to Matt for his Baja Blast of the week. What do you got for us this week, Matthew?
So Baja Blast of the week this week is just waiting. I don't know when it's coming out, but soon, hopefully. So I've successfully convinced my oldest son to be a fan of Taco Bell. So I got to work on the other two as they get older. But the oldest, his thing is the Crunchwrap Supreme. And This year they are putting a giant Cheez-It as the middle thing in a Crunchwrap Supreme. And we are both extremely excited for when that happens. So when it happens, I will eat one on the pod. But we went to Taco Bell yesterday, and both were a little bit sad that it hasn't happened yet.
And does he understand why his middle name is Chalupa now? Is that
it was a little confusing for the first couple of years, but he gets it now.
Okay. That nonsense aside, as I mentioned, the first day of the NFL draft is tomorrow. We talked about it a little bit last week. Alec Lewis at The Athletic wrote an article about decision-making in the draft and the fact that it appears to be from a theoretical perspective, drafting is sort of a solved problem, but nobody uses the solution. And a big basis for that is work that Cade has done. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the work you've done on this and sort of your experience as to why, even though everyone knows what they should do, very few teams actually do it?
Well, I loved Alec's article because I think it captures the messiness of the process very well. So I thought it was fantastically done. He invested heavily in that. I didn't talk to him, but I know that he'd worked on it for months, and it was nice that he got the platform he got. Seth, I think I would push back on it being a solved problem, and to some extent his premise. So they set up the whole article that way, and I don't think that's fair to the challenge that the teams face in a couple ways. One, things change, right? I mean, this is not a stationary world these guys are operating in multiple ways. So back in the day when Jerry Jones and those guys came up with the chart, we didn't have free agency. That's based on trades before free agency existed. Free agency kicks in, changes the landscape. Almost 20 years later, the finally get a rookie salary cap again changes the landscape. But the game's changing, with so much more pass forward now that the positional values are different. So it's a dynamic thing. And if it's dynamic, it means it's not solved. But also we address it in our paper and the way it usually gets talked about in the analytics space, focusing on, what's the value of trading one pick for another pick. And that's just one little bitty slice of the roster building challenge that the GMs face. And so no one has modeled the entire roster building process. So it's not just, we make a big mistake when we say this pick for that pick. It's really should be this bundle of picks for that bundle of picks. We have to consider the compensation cost of those bundles. But then we also have to consider, we're trying to put 53 guys on an active roster. If I pick up a defensive end in the draft, it means I have one less defensive end I need to pick up in free agency. But if I don't, I got to pick them up in free agency. I got to consider who I'm signing off of my roster, keeping versus letting go. All of those things are connected. We can't make the optimal choice at one point in time without considering all of these things. And that's really hard. And no one has that whole model. And so I think one of the reasons it's done differently in different places and resisted and is because it does involve all of these challenges and this complexity. That's not the only reason. I'm not letting everyone off the hook, but we have to see it in its entirety to really understand how hard the process actually is.
Yeah, obviously I'm being a little flippant by describing it as solved, but I think that really if we want to make the pure version of the point is there are kind of some rules to live by, and those often get sort of thrown by the wayside. I've certainly experienced this in another sport, but you get kind of, the combination of overconfidence and anchoring biases and deal fever and stuff like that. So many of these decisions are making mistakes that people have made before, but it becomes the Arrested Development meme. It's like, oh, but maybe it'll work for us.
That's right. And, on top of all of that, these buildings are complicated buildings. It's not like the general manager is sitting there in perfect silence and gets to do exactly what he wants to do without input from anybody else, and no one ever complains or tries to push his opinion around. He's sitting there hearing from many different voices, right? He's got a whole scout room, but then he's got coaches that have been jumping into his office for the last couple of months. He's got an owner that may or may not be jumping into the conversation. And that's a lot to balance, and it's complicated. So look, we should call it out when we see it, because all the biases you just named are played out every year. But we also have to be a little gracious about how complicated the process is.
I think this draft is especially interesting in that it really plays into the positional value in the fact that there are a bunch of really great quarterbacks, there are a bunch of really great receivers, and a bunch of really great offensive linemen, especially tackles. And there really aren't that many standout running backs or linebackers. Last year we were talking about how running backs are not pointless, but that their value is a little bit down. And we see 2 running backs get drafted really early in the draft. These teams are there. They're still trying to pick the best players. And it just so happens that there aren't those top end running backs. And so from the outside world, for those that are just kind of analyzing the draft, it's like, oh, look, everybody's got these great mock drafts with all these receivers and the positional values there. It just happens that there are really good players at those key positions. And so I think it looks from the outside, and we'll see tomorrow, or as people are listening to this tonight, probably, we'll see what ends up happening. But I think that is an interesting aspect with this draft, where you don't have some top end players at those kind of lesser positions. And so it hopefully makes decisions a little bit easier for these general managers. But I think that's really interesting how that played out this year.
The one exception to that is, and this is maybe not a positional value thing, this is more of a historical ability to identify thing. I think the one exception to that might be Brock Bowers. Just in terms of, that's maybe I'm conflating 2 issues here, but it's sort of like, it's okay. People have had a hard time identifying who the best quarterback is going to be. It really seems like that's been the case with tight ends as well.
Right. And I think it's in some ways more confounded with tight ends. I don't know if this is true, but it feels to me like we feel more certain than ever when we see the top tight end prospect that he maps onto what we think of as the all-pro tight end. Somehow we year after year, we think, oh, this guy is a guaranteed lock, and my God, he's going to be so valuable. And somehow that's not true, but it seems more that way with tight ends than with other tight ends. And you're right. I think Bowers is going to be a fascinating storyline this year. But I think Matt's got a very interesting point, because I think most teams, I don't know this because I only work with one team right now, and I've only ever worked with a handful, but it seems to me that you don't get to position value in a draft unless you get there philosophically, because it typically doesn't fall out of the traditional scouting process. For decades, guys have been rated on a scale, some scale, whatever your scale is, whatever your organization does, whatever your scouting tree uses. And there aren't these positional adjustments baked in. I mean, they're very much, this is the scale. Only if the organization, the GM, somebody after the fact is pushing positions up and down based on positional value does that happen. And I don't think many organizations are doing that very explicitly.
I think you see what happened with the free agency contracts of the running back market this year, where you had a bunch of top end deals, right? Saquon, Derrick Henry, Aaron Jones, a bunch of guys signed really big contracts, which was not the direction that things were going in free agency for running backs. Mm-hmm. And so, like Cade, you were talking about the tie-in of the NFL draft with free agency decisions, with who's available, with who's on individual teams and when contracts are expiring. Like, so much is going into these decisions that really it's hard, like you're saying, that nothing's solved. And when you're working in a people world like this, nothing will ever be solved. We can just hope people are making, the best decisions that they can.
Right. Hopefully their heuristics get a little smarter over time.
So I want to stick a little bit with Bowers here, because do enough drafts, someone's going to quote unquote be right on the top tight end, whether they were, right for the right reasons or just kind of, this kind of a stop clock kind of thing. But so much of this analysis is retrospective. How do we go about deciding when, we have these sort of historically based, somewhere between rules and maxims? Do you have any suggestions for how we go about sort of when to break outside of those, while at the same time, like, countenancing the fact that you're probably overconfident in your own evaluation if you're doing so?
You're talking about a very general issue in forecasting of non-stationarity, and it's absolutely fundamental to forecasting. You have to know, to what extent does the future map onto the past? I mean, are we in the same state or not? This is a primary consideration in forecasting, and we have almost no research on it psychologically. We don't know much about how people reason about it, so we don't have all these biases or rationality, whichever way it is, probably biases, documented. I've done a little bit of work in this space, and if I had to hypothesize, the general tendency, Seth, is to think that the world is changing more than it actually has. Now, again, you can get it wrong in both directions, and people do get it wrong in both directions, and people don't think about this enough, and it's hard. All of that's true. But if I had to pick a bias, I would say people are biased towards believing tomorrow is going to be more different from today than it actually is. And so that's going to lead people to say, now things are different. Now tight ends are more valuable. Now we see them better. And so I'm going to go ahead and make the play for Bowers, despite the history.
I think especially you look at like Dalton Kincaid in the year that he had this last year as a first round tight end. I could definitely see that happening, where GMs and teams are like, well, it didn't necessarily happen in the past, but last year we had some really good rookie tight ends that played well. And so we're past that now. We're in a new era of the tight end. But I think tight end's a tricky one because they do so many different things. When you have a position that does kind of one main thing, it's a little bit easier to project, right? A receiver, they catch the ball. Tight ends, they have to be really good blockers. They have to be really good pass catchers. They're involved in so many different things that it's a little tricky. And I say this as a former tight end, I'm biased. It's the best position, but it can be hard to project. And you look at, Brock Bowers versus Darnell Washington, right? Both played at Georgia, both played tight end, but one's 6'7", 275 and incredibly athletic and does some really good things. And, Brock Bowers is 6'4", 240 or whatever he is. And they're very different body types. They're very different players, but they play the same position. And so it's, one, what is his skill set? What does that project to at the next level? But then also, how does that fit within our team? And it's a really complicated project, but I think that the team fit is such a big part of the draft and who these teams are drafting. It's not just, all right, well, we're going to take the best player. They're always concerned about like best player at position of need or team fit. I think it's every offensive coordinator has changed in the NFL in the past 2 seasons. And, these coaching staffs and schemes are changing so much. So do we really need to emphasize team fit when we're probably going to be in a different scheme and in the not too distant future? It's a lot to think about.
It's so tough because it shows that there are returns to stability. And of course you don't want stability around mediocrity, but if you can finally get something that's stable, you can start at least putting some weight on fit, because we know fit matters to some extent. Teams can overdo it. And as you say, it's terrible to overdo if it's changing all the time. But if you're stable enough that you really figure out the right pieces, then you have an advantage on other teams that aren't stable. It's just an advantage you have. I love your point about tight ends being harder to evaluate because the things that they need to do to excel are more different from each other than most other positions. You can think about quarterback being, another. It's even got more dimensions that are relatively unrelated to each other. Really tough. I think about it in exactly these terms when it comes to head coaching hires. which I think is, in major college football and NFL, it's just extraordinarily complicated and difficult. And it's because of all the different things they have to be good at. And these things are not only unrelated, they sometimes might be negatively related. So they're really hard to pick. And Matt, you're the former tight end, so maybe you can speak to this, but what these really good tight ends do beyond being good pass catchers and good blockers, when they're out there running routes, they do this little magic thing where they find space. Like, despite all the efforts and all the focus that the defense puts on them, they still magically find space. That seems its own quality. People talk about they'll need to be fast. Yeah, they need to be fast, but they've got this ability to find space despite all the coverage that seems kind of magical to the non-tight ends among us.
Well, I think a lot of it comes from the fact that tight ends do so much. Like, they're involved in the run game, they're involved in the pass game. And so tight ends have to have a really good football IQ to play the position, because they have to understand everything that's happening on offense. Similar to like a quarterback, right? Quarterbacks have to know everything, right? They have to know all of the defensive coverages that they might see. They have to know all of the blitzes that might come at them, the right fronts to check, runs, to audible. And then obviously they have to know everything for their own offense. So they're like the masters of football IQ. If you ever talk to an NFL quarterback or one of those guys, it's like, everything about everything. Like, it's wild. Right. But the tight ends is similar. So they have to know a really broad aspect of the game of football. And I think that helps. There are a bunch of stories about Travis Kelce that have come out recently where he's not actually running the right route. He's just, I know I have to kind of be in this area and I'll get open. And it works because he has Patrick Mahomes, who's a really good improviser, and Andy Reid, who's letting them do all of this. And, similar what you were talking about earlier with stability, like the Chiefs are probably the prime example of that. They have Patrick Mahomes on a 10-year contract. Andy Reid, I think, just signed another 5-year deal. Like, they are set at the head coach and quarterback position for a long time. Mm-hmm. And now they can make decisions that are a little bit more forward thinking than many NFL teams do. And whether it's how they're going to construct their roster or free agency moves, or we're going to spend a little bit more money this year on, Chris Jones. And I know that's not a deal that they would normally make in the past, but because they have that stability, they're able to think about everything a little bit differently.
It reminds me a little bit of Belichick and Brady, where they had that same stability, and they knew, I need this kind of piece, I need that kind of piece, and they just slotted people in. And literally, sometimes it was the slot receiver. They knew the kind of slot receiver they needed, and just year over year, they got that guy.
That is a good a natural link to something I wanted to talk about, which ties a little bit of this together. Is I've always liked to think of players in terms of archetypes. You mentioned that the two Georgia tight ends, there's sort of the poles are sort of the ones that are closest to being like a tackle or a guard almost, and then the ones that are closest to being a receiver. Where do you get the point where one of these guys of this archetype is going to be produced at a first round level? I'll let someone else find out which one it is. Do you see that as a profitable way to sort of conduct business versus, all right, this is an archetype that has that is worth a gamble on because the success rate is higher?
I'd say it's an interesting question, and I don't have empirics on inclinations around that. So one version of the question is, does it pay to figure out the archetype for a position and then kind of invest in that whenever you can? And my inclination would, and again, I don't have the empirics on it, but my inclination would be, it goes back to price. What's the price of your investments there? It's like anything at the right price, right? I'll sell anything if it's high enough. I'll buy anything that's low enough. And they are facing that. GMs face that exact question in the free agent market. They face that question in the draft. I would bet that the archetypal player that for a given position is fully priced, if not overpriced. So I would be inclined to try to nibble around at the edges and let the market pay full price or overpay for the canonical tight end. And I would look, it's kind of the Billy Bean, let's look for the inefficiencies that because they don't quite fit the portrait.
I'm thinking of it more archetype and the more of it in sort of a leave one out. Okay, the archetypal player has this. That's obviously if the guy can do all those things, he's the number one pick of the first round. Okay, if we remove like we're talking about quarterbacks, we remove pocket presence. What does that do? We remove, go from A+ arm strength to B+ arm strength. What is that like? I almost define the archetypes as what sort of class of flaws almost does this guy have? I mean, obviously, yes, if you have Superman, that's an easy evaluation. But it's sort of like, what are the things they don't do? How likely is that to be a problem? Or how likely are the things they do able to be?
Right. This is a terrifically interesting question. I think it's going to I think we can almost not say anything general about it because it varies so much by position. But some general things that I would lean towards, or at least ask if I were in the data, are there traits that a position has to have, the floors that they have to have? And that exists. And so let's identify those. And then the other end of it is, are there traits that are in and of themselves sufficient? And this is almost never going to be the case, but it could be that, if a guy's big enough and fast enough, he's going to succeed at edge, kind of almost regardless. Maybe. I think the floors are probably more common. But Seth, I worry in general about trait focused because I think we as humans tend to have a hard time considering multiple dimensions at the same time. We want to simplify it down to one dimension. Look at the arm talent on that guy. And how can that guy not be successful in the NFL given what his arm can do? It's like, well, it turns out a quarterback needs to be good at like 12 things. We're lousy at keeping our head around all 12 things at any given time. And so I think we tend to oversimplify. So the traits conversation, I worry about it a little bit because we mostly need to keep our eye on multiple traits for most positions. But I do think it's going to vary position by position.
What archetype was Wemby in Wembanyama?
Yeah, right. No, geez, my God.
I mean,
2045 NBA player, or the 2100 NBA player.
No, the first time I saw him, it was like, oh, if we'd have had color video of Lou Alcindor in high school at Power Memorial, that's what it would look like. So that's just a guy on the short list of the 3 greatest players of all time. That's his archetype, and so far so good, I would say. So I was going to say, Matt, I think has done some work for us internally, like really trying to identify like what are the key bits, and some of those are in our data we kind of separate trait, which is like what a guy does versus production versus how well they do it. And Matt has done some interesting work sort of identifying those from a data perspective, like, okay, these are the important questions we're asking about each of these guys. What are those questions?
Yeah, I think that for me, I really start with the line play, offensive line and defensive line when I'm looking at our data, because a lot of what we collect is not available anywhere else. We're collecting every single block that an offensive lineman does, and where it happens on the field, who's involved, where it starts, where it ends, when it starts, when it ends. And so we get this deeper data set of actual production, of actual movement. And so I think that, we get the NFL teams get a little bit of that with the next gen stats data. They get positional data. They get 10 times per second. They get direction and orientation of the player. But with that, they are just imputing blocks, right? These 2 players are close. We assume that they're being blocked. And there's a lot of squishiness in that analysis that's happening. With our data, it's we know exactly when and where that starts, 30 times a second, when that ends, the exact frame. And so for the offensive lineman and defensive lineman, we've been able to really dive into what does an individual base block look like when these guys are double teaming, how much are they able to move a defensive player? And so I think that for me, I'm not sitting here claiming like, oh, well, here we are, we've got all these answers of exactly the right things that translate from one level to the next, and every team should be doing this. But I think for me, that's where I start, is those positions that have not really had great data in the past. And so, one thing that I found with our data is for a defensive lineman, an edge rusher, he really has 3 parts to his rush. It's he's never going to be unblocked. So it's how quickly can he get to the offensive lineman and like start the engagement? How quickly can he get off of the block? And then how well does he finish his pass rush? Like, is he able to, whether he's turning the corner on a tackle and then get around that and kind of run the hoop to the quarterback to finish the sack? What does that look like? And so with our data, we have physical metrics for how good a D end's get off is. We have our length of engagement. And so a great example for me that I was looking at was Chop Robinson. So one thing that he is great at and he excels at is his get off. So he has a great get off. He is also really good with his hands when he is being blocked. He does a really good job of getting off the block. And so there was a play I was looking at where the center had moved the ball and Chop Robinson was the first person to move. The center wasn't the first person to move, like his body. He had obviously moved the ball, but his feet were still. None of the offensive linemen had moved, none of the receivers, nobody that actually knew the snap count had moved, but Chop Robinson had gotten off the ball. Like it was wild to see. And so I think that, for the defensive end, being able to really dive into, okay, I really want to know exactly what goes into a good, effective pass rush. Now, can we find something in the data that would help us identify what that looks like? I think using tracking data can really give teams an advantage, as they're saying, we have this tracking data from NGS. We've built a bunch of models on our own players and free agency, but what are we going to do when we're looking at draft? It's, well, we have these models, but we need that at the college level as well to then be able to model these college players and then how they're going to translate into the pros.
I love it because you move from traits to actual production, that you simplify the problem. It's still a super complicated problem, right? But you've greatly simplified it because you're actually looking at what they care about. You're not trying to predict what they care about from their traits. You're looking at what they actually care about. You're talking through edges in a way that reminds me of something that I think we've made huge progress on with receivers in recent years. We've decomposed their performance into essentially, can they get open? Can they separate? How well they catch the ball when it's thrown to them, and then yards after catch. So these are the things that we care about, and they're different. And we now understand some guys excel at one without excelling the others, and we can look at the relative importance of the three, and it's really, really helpful. But it's all production based. It's not trait based. We can take the previous step and start asking what traits lead to these qualities, and that might be an important thing. But what you're describing sounds fantastic. The questions I'd ask you back, Matt, the challenges I'm guessing you have is, especially as you start trying to model college guys, the context these guys are playing in varies so much across teams because of the opposition, because of their line mates. And so this is the challenge we all face all the time.
Yeah, no, totally.
Somehow adjusting for the quality of the guy next to him, which is going to make a huge difference, and the qualities of the guys opposite them.
Yeah, I think the opponent adjustment is obviously a big deal. You look at a player like Jared Verse for Florida State, great end. He had another great end on the opposite side, and Braden Fisk playing on the interior of that D-line. Like, he had a really good job. And one of the things that we do is we collect individual blocks so we know if it was a one-on-one block or if he was double teamed. And so we can look at stuff like that and say, all right, well, Chop Robinson, his rushes against one-on-one against the tackle, we can pull those up really easily. Because a lot of times it's like, okay, well, there's this one good player. We're going to send extra protection his way. We'll maybe chip him with a tight end or a running back, or, even double team him with a couple of our offensive linemen. And so with the data, we have a little bit easier way to do some of that, where it's, okay, well, we're trying to make these as similar as possible. It's a rush situation. It's a one-on-one situation, and nobody's there to help. And you can do a little bit of it that way. But as you've done a bunch of modeling. That's tricky for all sports and regardless of what you're trying to model, for sure.
For sure. But a beautiful thing is that everything you just talked about now needs to be credited to the player that draws that extra attention. So it's not just let's control for context and ask how they do given a situation. Let's also consider how that player changes the situation, and let's figure out how to give him credit when he's drawn that extra attention, because it's going to help the rest of the defense. We can only do that now because of the kind of data and video you're talking about.
The other thing about Matt's description that I think he kind of, I'm not even sure you were aware you're doing this, Matt, but sort of slipped in, is the marrying of the quantitative and the tracking data with I think what would be a more scouting, an eye test kind of thing. He uses his hands really well. And that's another difficulty of it is you have to sort of synthesize between essentially two linguistic systems almost. So something that's always fascinated me, Cade, and I'm wondering if this is something that has sort of come up in the teams you've worked with, is qualitative data is important, but asking the scouts to be precise in their language almost. So it's like, I've told this story on this pod before, but when I first got to the Bucks, we did kind of just as a lark, we kind of did a natural language search of kind of our scouting reports and like did a word cloud, and giant like 83 point in the middle of the word cloud was good. And it's just like we like, okay, well that's a word that is essentially meaningless in our scouting reports since it's so common. But how good? And do we have a scale for that? And then obviously quantifying something like uses his hands well is difficult, but I think that a good scout will probably be able to differentiate between levels, with some lossiness, obviously, but differentiate between levels of that and either formally or informally kind of put that in your mental model of how these traits translate into production. And frankly, like trying to systematize that language was something that was not well received by the professional scouting establishment. But I was sort of wondering if you've sort of approached a similar problem.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's not well received. I can also imagine once they know anything about the analysis that was run or what was found when you looked at the archival data, then they can play to the test if they want to play to the test. And it's be hard for them not to play to the test. So now you have to hide the results, and it's not great. I think it's great for an archival test. It's much harder moving forward. Where I've seen things like that work more effectively is in the makeup evaluation, the character evaluations across sports. That teams that, this is really important and really hard to do well. Some very sophisticated people effectively punt on the whole thing because they think whatever is there, you can't measure, and you're wasting your time trying to measure. And I have to honor that those people are sharp, and that's what they've decided to do. But other teams and other sharp teams keep on trying to make some progress and have found signal in the character evaluations, but they typically do it, Seth, by really decomposing character into attributes that they want to focus on. They're not just taking it as, this is the received wisdom or this is a conventional way. It's like, what do we care about? How are we going to operationalize that? Training the scouts on what that means and what to be, and however they're looking for it, this is what we're looking for. That decomposition and drilling down and training is vital. That if you're going to find any signal in makeup and character evaluations, it's going to be through some process that looks like that. So it's not exact language, Seth, but it is narrow and common understanding and involved training.
Some of that data can be so equivocal too. There's opposite interpretations of so many things. Like a player gets into it with a coach on the sideline. If you like the player, he's fiery and competitive. Kelsey running up and bumping Andy Reid in the Super Bowl. That's just they have a great relationship and yada yada yada. Yeah. But if they go on to lose that game, oh my gosh, the lack of discipline and so we almost the narrative about what that means is almost retrodictive rather than predictive.
Reasonable. I mean, there's an argument. This is really hard to do, but there's an argument to be made that character evaluation should be done by different people or separately, kind of specialize in different, so that you don't have those spillovers you're talking about. I hypothesis I carry. I don't have evidence on this, but I feel like a lot of makeup evaluations are a waste of time. But that sometimes you find signals in the tails, that sometimes you find character that is sufficiently strong that it really is worth putting some weight on. Or other end of the scale, you find some character issues that are disqualifying, and that trying to cut it fine in the middle is kind of a waste of time. But I think the exercise might be worthwhile just on the low probability that you do find something in the tails.
That's been sort of the public research that I've seen done on this in basketball suggests that the signal in sort of a good character evaluation is a character that is evaluated well or is seen as a positive, I guess, is more the absence of sort of the red flag, where that sort of red flag does carry some pretty heavy negative. So reducing the size of the haystack, even if it's just lopping off that 5-10% of players who show up with that red flag, that's it's a marginal gain, but we're talking about marginal gains here.
And I think that character is one way that people do that, but you look at the rise of intelligence tests as well, and I guess the fall for the Wonderlic of how people are valuing that. But what happened with like the S2 cognition test and CJ Stroud, like I think that was one where it came out and people almost had that, like he had the negative tail, right? He did so poorly that how could you draft somebody like that? Like if he was more average, you'd be like, all right, well, we can work around that. And so I think that quarterback is a position where that seems to have kind of made people more wary or been more impressed with the intelligence tests. But I think that it goes into a similar bucket of the character test, where it's not production based and it's squishy and it's difficult to find those that are going to be accurate. If we're talking about like the cognitive tests or the intelligence tests, character tests, I think are either they are or they aren't, unless it's one of those like, yeah, he was super fiery and mad at his coach, and that, like you're talking about, Seth, like that's a good thing. He's a competitor. He has fire in him or whatever. And I think that comes with interesting drawbacks with the intelligence tests as well. When you're looking at other ways that you can try to evaluate players, that's another thing that we have seen teams use and have kind of disregarded the Wonderlic. It feels like to a certain degree. But definitely something that people are using. They're looking for any sort of edge they can find. People are working with the data from what actually happens, but what else can we get? What else can we find?
Of course, and they should. By the way, did people make a fuss over Adunze's repeated efforts at the combine? Remember, he stuck around to do I think it was the 3-cone drill. Do I have that right? And
yes.
I was like, oh, this is phenomenal, because I mean, literally, it's never been seen done in the history of the combine. But I was also like, okay, and now players are going to start doing that in the future just to give the same signal, now that they know people pay attention to it.
Yeah, it's one of those things that like you get people who are, hey, I need to be the first person in the gym or the first person at the office, and then they just are wasting time while they're there just to have that signal. But I remember seeing that and seeing the media be like, oh my gosh, like he's such a competitor. Like he was so disappointed. He wanted to do it over and over again just to get it right.
I mean, it could be true, Matt, right? I mean, let's be cynical, but because he was the first one to ever do it, I put a little more credence on it. It is exactly the kind of thing you want to see. It's like, you want to see intrinsic motivation. You want to see a guy persisting at some hard task just because he wants to improve it. It's just a hard thing to observe. You don't have any chances to observe that.
I've got a experience with that. When we drafted Thon Maker, when I was with the Bucks, he came in, and like the 1 hour on-court workout that NBA draft prospects do is no joke from a physical effort standpoint. And
what does it involve, Seth?
It depends. So if you're doing a 3-on-3 workout or an individual workout, and his in fact was individual, but it's basically like you're going full speed for basically an hour with like 6 coaches yelling at you. And it's like, like a job, like the highest pressure job interview where you're also sweaty and exhausted. So he did this, and like, great motor, does all this, and then like does some interviews, and then goes and like works out on his own in our facility for an hour and a half. And everyone's like, oh man, this is awesome. And that actually almost in some way turned out like is a laudable trait, but it almost turned out to be negative, because one of his problems when he got in the league is he couldn't get and put weight on, because he was doing so much. Like he was eating 8,000 calories a day and couldn't put weight on, in part because he was doing all this extra work. I mean, it's sort of funny, even something that is generally a positive, like how that trait actually may have ended up being deleterious almost in the long run to him developing the way he needed to.
He needed some coachability. I'm curious how we get at coachability. I've talked with general managers and coaches from around different leagues, different professional sports leagues. And they identify this as one of the most important things. They want competitiveness, of course. They want grit, but they want coachability. this guy you're talking about, Seth, needed to be able to bend his practices. He needed to be able to hear, okay, that's great, but you got to do something different for what you need right now.
That particular is a hard one, I think, across sports, because it's a highly competitive field, and the people who tend to make it to the professional level are the ones who have been, they're psychos about it, not DSM version of it, but and so it's like, you mentioned grit and how that can be like that ironclad self-confidence, how that can almost be the thing that got you here might be the thing that gets you out of here too, almost in some ways. I want to end just getting your thoughts and Matt's thoughts and see what you're looking for tomorrow night and throughout the draft in terms of trends we might see, in terms of positions, traits that are valued, trades and movement, stuff like that. So I'll start with you, Matt, and then give the last word to Cade.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it earlier, but I am interested just by the sheer fact that a lot of the positions of need are filled with really great players. It seems like for each of them, whether it's Caleb Williams at quarterback, or there was some talk, but I think we're all pretty dialed into Marvin Harrison Jr. as the top receiver. Outside of that top one, there's like a grouping of 3 players who are really good, whether it's Jaden Daniels, Drake May, if we're adding JJ McCarthy, which it seems like maybe teams are, into that next group. At receiver, Malik Neighbors, Roma Dunze, Brian Thomas Jr. It's what of the kind of next group, you have kind of your clear number one at a lot of these positions. The next group, what is it that teams are going to value? Because each receiver is a little bit different. Each of those quarterbacks plays a little bit differently. That's something that's really interesting to me. We have just a lot of really good players in these key positions. And so which traits are going to be the ones that teams value, and which, and Kev was talking a little bit about this, our producer on the show here before we started, of draft day is his favorite day just because he loves the intersection of teams getting new players. How does
his favorite movie too?
In? It is a great movie. It's so ridiculous, but it's amazing. I would agree. So I am really interested to see that kind of the traits that teams value and where guys fit in with these teams.
It's always so much fun. It kind of doesn't matter what goes down. It's almost always something interesting is going to happen. It's a terrifically interesting quarterback class to watch. I think I'm kind of especially curious. It's all the jockeying at the top is going to be fascinating, but I'm curious where Nix and Penix end up on that next tier. Where they end up can really make or break their careers, and I think it's going to be an interesting storyline to follow for the next couple of years. I'm always interested in trades. I mean, that's kind of where I came from originally, and you keep on waiting for people to get a little sharper on trades and not follow the traditional chart because it does seem so misvalued. But so it's always dramatic for me when someone just ponies up and pays real steep prices at the traditional price, and it just you kind of discover that it's a men from the boys on the sharp scale. Which clubs are sharp and which clubs may not be as sharp. And this year, maybe in the later rounds, it'll be interesting to see if teams try to get future picks because of NIL, because if you're underclassmen, it may be a thinner draft. Do people think, well, I'd rather be participating in the 25 draft than 24, and we see more trades for future picks, or at least attempts? So that part of it's always interesting to me.
I think you mentioned, separating the sharp from the square a little bit. In your observation, how confident would you be in your sort of internal evaluation of, and I'm not going to ask you who's good and who's bad, but how confident would you be in your sort of the spectrum of teams that quote unquote draft well versus those that don't? Or is it we just don't have enough trials to really even make that distinction?
Well, because we don't have a lot of trials, my confidence is low. But also draft well, I'd want to partition into 2 big bins. One is picking players, and the other is managing the draft capital. And in picking players, I mean, my data suggests that there aren't big differences in teams. That teams that have a real good draft one year tend to not have as good a draft the next year. It's just there's a lot of noise. in that because it's really hard. So I'm not going to evaluate teams' ability to pick players. I don't think there's huge differences, but I am happy to at least sort teams tentatively by their ability to manage their draft capital. And any one year is hard to say, but patterns over multiple years start revealing whether there's a philosophy there or not. And people are inconsistent, Seth. I mean, even Belichick, as much as he traded back, periodically traded up. And, Howie Roseman manages his draft capital really well, but he occasionally will trade up. And you've got to allow teams these opportunities to push their chips in a little bit, dial up chance a little bit, get completely sold on a player periodically, especially when they've got a history of kind of prudent management of their draft capital. Every now and then they're going to step up. So I'm reluctant to, on any given trade, say too much, but when you start seeing the patterns, I think you can start speaking more confidently about how they're thinking about that part of the game. It's a really important part of the game for a front office.
Kind of to finish where we started, you have to put together a roster of 53 and an extra 6th-round pick, an extra 6th-round pick there. All of a sudden it's like, oh, we are pretty happy with 46 of the 53, and that matters. And we've talked in this pod about particularly the Ravens sort of able to have a little bit of resiliency in the face of injuries because of sort of the quality that goes up and down the roster. And so that's where those things sort of start to show up is everyone's probably fine if everything goes well, but
Right.
like we know in sports it doesn't.
Well, the Ravens are a good example of stability. That's more or less the same scouting organization for the entire history, literally the entire history of the franchise. And they've had a similar philosophy on the types of players, the character, the management of draft capital. And when you have a consistent philosophy stacks up over years, they're just looking for little edges. From what we gather, they're looking for little edges, but they stack them consistently. And this past year was a great example of those little edges paying off.
Well, I think that's a great spot to end. Cade, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything that before we let you get out of here, anything that you're working on that you would like to plug? I'm sure you've talked. I know for a fact you guys have talked a ton about the draft on Wharton Moneyball. But anything else that you'd like people to check in on?
Thaler and I and a broader team are looking at the draft curve and that research again after all these years to see how much things have changed, what's changed. And so we're into the data now. We'll have something out sometime over the next few months, and it'll be fun. We've got a little new work also on working with draft data, scouting data on what we call mechanical aggregation. Like, what can we do without sitting down at a table and kind of hashing it out? Can we just take scouts' reports and integrate them in some way that gives us a board that's sensible, that does as well as other boards? What does it look like doing that? And,
good.
Some teams, good. Yeah, right. This, some organizations, especially in leagues like baseball, they use models to set their board initially. Sometimes some use models to set the board entirely, but that kind of mechanical process is a great starting place at the very least. And we're working with real data and a real organization to see how we can help them do that well and what gains come from that. So that's going to be an academic paper. We've got a working paper out. We're presenting that in some places. That'll be floating around at some point too.
Well, that sounds super interesting, especially I think that if it sort of percolates down into the professional space, I think elucidating how you do that, sort of how you create the input data for that mechanical process, I think that would be a nice bit of ammo for people in sort of our end of the shop to use to sort of okay, don't scout differently, just write the report a little different in a way. Well, thank you so much for coming on somewhat short notice on what is a very busy week. Pleasure as always to chat with you.
Great talking to you, Seth. Appreciate y'all having me.
Yeah, and I think that'll do it for this week. We will be back next week with probably some post-draft thoughts, and at some point we're probably going to do a little bit of tie a little bit of a bow around the transfer portal, which is also going strong for Matt and Professor Cade Massey from Wharton School of Business at University of Pennsylvania. Thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you later.